Picture a galaxy, not the kind your sky charts show you scattered and pretty and dead. A living one, every star claimed, every world numbered, every species that ever crawled out of its own oceans cataloged, measured, and folded into the great machine we call the Conquered. And the machine runs on one thing: law. Not law the way the soft-minded species once meant it, a suggestion, a hope, a thing argued about in chambers. Real law, enforced law. Law with teeth in it and a fleet behind it, so that, when the Conquered says a thing shall be, the thing simply is, across 10,000 systems without exception. I am an assessor of that machine. My work is the dead. When a vessel falls silent, when a colony goes dark, when something that should obey stops obeying, they send me to walk through the wreckage and write down why. I have cataloged the deaths of 41 species. I have never been surprised. Order does not surprise. Order is the absence of surprise. That is the whole point of it. And then they sent me to the human ship. It was drifting at the cold edge of a system that did not matter, a wooden-hearted thing of metal and patched hull, and by every law the Conquered has ever written it should not have worked. There was no central command core, no sovereign processor, no single will threaded through the crew to make them move as one. By our models, that ship should have been a tomb full of creatures who had torn each other apart the moment the pressure rose. Instead, it had held formation to the very end. It had died in order. And the thing that held it together was not a weapon, and it was not a king. It was a single sheet of pressed plant fiber, signed in ink, by men who had every reason to betray it. We had been taught the humans were the most lawless beasts in the catalog. We were about to learn we had been taught wrong, and that the truth was far stranger. So let us go back to the beginning, the problem nobody in the Conquered wanted to write down. To understand why this ship terrified my superiors, you first have to understand what we believed about creatures like its crew. And I do not mean the polite version we put in the public record. I mean what the Enforcer Corps actually believed in the rooms where the decisions are made. They believed that law is gravity, that it must come from a great mass at the center, pressing down, holding the small things in their orbits. Remove the center and the small things fly apart. This was not a theory to us. It was the bedrock of the entire Conquered. We had absorbed 41 species by finding their center of gravity, their throne, their core, and seizing it. Take the head and the body kneels. It had worked every time, 41 times. The humans had no head we could find, and yet the body had not flown apart. When my pod docked with the wreck, the readings made no sense. The interior was a record of brutality. There were marks of violence on the bulkheads, old and deep. There was evidence the crew had lived in conditions my own people would have called a death sentence, packed close, half-starved, sicknesses passing through them like weather. These were not gentle beings. These were raiders. The logs, once I broke them open, were a confession of theft and blood across a dozen shipping lanes. By the standard model, this should have been the easy kind of death to assess. Animals in a box, given enough hunger and enough time, do what animals do. But the bodies were not arranged like animals who had turned on each other. They were arranged like a crew that had fought something larger and lost together. The wounded had been moved to a central hold and tended. The food, what little remained, had been divided into equal portions, down to the gram, with one portion left untouched beside a body too far gone to eat it. Animals do not leave a fair share for the dying. Animals do not measure. Something here had been measuring carefully right up until the end. And I stood in that cold hold with my instruments humming and felt, for the first time in my career, the thing I had built my whole life to never feel. I did not understand what I was looking at. So I did what an assessor is trained to do. I reached for the model. I told myself it was an anomaly, a fluke, a crew that happened to be unusually disciplined before the disease or the void took them. I filed the preliminary report exactly as my superiors expected. Lawless human raider vessel, crew deceased, cause of social cohesion unknown, recommend the standard finding. The standard finding is a simple one. Lawless species are leaderless beasts. They are driven by appetite and held by fear, and where neither appetite nor fear reaches, they collapse. They are not to be studied. They are to be catalogued, and where they pose risk to conquered order erased. I wrote those words. I believed them when I wrote them. I had believed them for 200 years. And then the ship's logs, which I had only meant to skim, refused to let me close them. There was a document referenced again and again in every entry by every voice. They called it the Articles. The crew spoke of it the way my own people speak of the conquered itself, with a weight that did not fit anything a beast should feel. So I opened it, and the model began, very quietly, to come apart in my hands. The deeper I read, the worse the contradiction became, and I want you to sit with how strange it truly was, because the Enforcer Corps spent a great deal of effort later trying to make sure you never would. These were thieves. Let us not pretty it up the way the human stories later did. They took what was not theirs by force from beings weaker than themselves. They were violent, and the violence was real, and some of them enjoyed it. By any conquered measure, they were criminals of the lowest order. And yet they voted. The logs were full of it. When a course was disputed, the crew gathered, and each voice counted as one. The cabin boys the same as the gunners, and the captain did not simply decide. When spoils were taken, they were not seized by the strongest. They were divided by a fixed schedule, written down in advance, the captain receiving a larger share but not a limitless one, the wounded receiving compensation by a fixed rate depending on which limb or eye they had lost. There was a number for a lost hand. There was a different number for a lost leg. They had sat down, these murderers, in some cramped and stinking hold, and calmly agreed in advance what a man's hand was worth, so that no one could cheat the maimed when the blood was up and the gold was on the table. Worse, from the conquered's point of view, was what they had done to their own captain. In every species we had ever absorbed, the one at the center hoarded power. That is what centers do. But the human captain had agreed, in writing, in front of witnesses, to limits on himself. He could be questioned. He could be removed by the same vote that raised him. There were matters on which his word was final in battle, in the chase, when one wrong order meant death for all, and there were matters on which his word counted for exactly one. They had built a thing where the most dangerous man aboard was also the most bound. They had caged their own strongest, and the strongest had walked into the cage on purpose and signed his name to the lock. I called the Enforcer Corps. I should not have. I told the Prime Enforcer what I had found, and I will not soon forget the silence on the channel. When the answer came, it was not curiosity. It was something closer to fear, dressed up as contempt. The Prime Enforcer ordered the record destroyed, not studied, destroyed. Burn the logs, scuttle the wreck, file the standard finding, and let the humans go down in the catalog as beasts. I asked why, and the answer I was given is the reason I am standing before this tribunal now, telling you all of it anyway. The Prime Enforcer said that if law could come from below, from the consent of the small things rather than the weight of the great one, then the entire foundation of the conquered was a story we told ourselves. And a story can be doubted. And a thing that can be doubted is not a foundation at all. Better, the Enforcer said, that no one ever learned these creatures had done it. So I did the one thing an assessor is forbidden to do. Before I obeyed, I kept reading. I wanted to know the man at the center of it. I wanted to know who walks into a cage on purpose. His name was Thomas Hale, and he was no one's idea of a hero, least of all his own. I reconstructed him from 1,000 fragments, from the logs and the letters, and the marks his crew left when they spoke of him. He had been a hard man from a hard world, the kind of place the conquered catalogs and forgets, where law was the rope and the lash and very little else. He had killed before he was grown. He had been on the wrong side of other men's law his whole life, and he had learned the lesson that world teaches its children, which is that power flows downhill and lands on whoever is standing lowest. By every prediction my model could make, Thomas Hale should have become a tyrant the instant he had a deck under him. He had the strength for it. He had the cruelty for it. He had spent his whole life being ruled by force, and the ones who survive that usually grow up wanting only to be the one holding the force. He did not, and the why of it is the strangest entry in the whole record. There was an account, set down years before the ship died, of how Hale had served under another captain first. A captain of the old kind, the kind the conquered would have understood perfectly. That captain ruled by terror alone. He took the largest share by simply taking it. He flogged on a whim and killed on a mood and answered to no one, because no one had the standing to ask. And his ship, by every law I had ever trusted, should have been the strongest of all, a perfect little conquered with a perfect little tyrant at its center. Instead, it rotted from the inside. The crew gave exactly the loyalty they were given, which was none. They worked slow. They hid the best of the loot. When the fighting came, they fought for themselves alone, because the captain had taught them that themselves alone was all anyone fought for. And one night, with no warning and no mercy, they put him over the side, and the ship that had been held by fear flew apart the moment the fear was gone, exactly the way my model said it should. Thomas Hale survived that. And Thomas Hale, against everything his world had taught him, drew the opposite lesson. He had watched the perfect tyrant and seen that the tyrant was weak, that a man who is only obeyed is never truly followed, that the day your strength slips, and it always slips, you are alone among people who owe you nothing. So when his own turn came, when the men put him forward to lead, he did the thing that made no sense to me and total sense to them. He gave power away in order to keep it. He let himself be bound, because he had seen with his own eyes that the unbound man stands alone, and the bound man stands inside a wall that the whole crew holds up around him. He had learned the deepest law in the galaxy, the one the conquered in all its vast machinery had never once written down. People will die for what they have chosen. They will only run from what has been forced on them. The articles were the form that wisdom took. And when I finally translated the central document, the thing the whole crew swore by, I understood why the prime enforcer wanted it burned. It was not grand. I think that is what struck me most, after 200 years of conquered law written in the soaring, terrible language of things that cannot be questioned. The articles were plain. They were almost insulting in their plainness, a list of ordinary agreements between ordinary men. Every share will be divided thus. The wounded will be compensated thus. No man will steal from another man aboard on pain of marooning. Disputes will be settled ashore and not aboard, so that the ship is never turned against itself in the one place it cannot afford to break. Lights out at a fixed hour. The captain commands in the chase and in the fight, and at all other times answers to the company. It read like a thing children might draft, if children were murderers, and that is exactly the source of its power, because every line of it was something a real man had to actually live with every single day, when the easier thing was always to cheat. And here is the part the human stories would later forget, and the part the prime enforcer wanted erased. They signed it, by choice, before a single coin was taken. The signing was the whole ritual of joining, more sacred to them than any oath to a flag or a crown. A man came aboard, and the articles were read to him aloud so that none could later claim he had not understood, and then he made his mark, and from that moment he was bound, and so was everyone who had marked before him, and so was Hale, bound hardest of all. There was no central authority forcing the ink. There was no conquered pressing down from above. There was only a circle of dangerous men, each agreeing to limit himself, because each had worked out in the cold arithmetic of survival that a crew of limited men was stronger than a mob of free ones. They had invented law from the bottom up. They had grown it like a plant from the floor of the ship, instead of dropping it from a throne, and it held. That was the thing I could not stop staring at in the cold of that hold. It held. Why did it hold? That is the question that kept me at the wreck 3 days past my orders, and the answer, once I worked it out, is the most dangerous idea I have ever carried back to this chamber. Conquered law works by enforcement. A great power above watches, and where it sees a breach, it punishes, and the fear of that punishment is the glue. It is expensive glue. It requires the great power to watch everywhere, always, forever, and the moment the watching stops, the glue dries to dust. We had simply never noticed the cost, because we had always paid it, fleets and enforcers and the endless machinery of the eye that never closes. The human code paid no such cost, because the watching was distributed. Every man aboard was the enforcer of every other. There was no need for an eye above, because there were 40 eyes around. A man who thought of cheating the wounded out of their fixed share was not weighing himself against a distant throne he might evade. He was weighing himself against the 40 men beside him, every one of whom had signed the same paper, every one of whom would lose if the paper meant nothing, every one of whom was therefore watching. The weak watched the strong because the code gave the weak a stake worth watching for. Fairness was not kindness. Fairness was structural. It made betrayal unprofitable because the betrayer faced not one enemy above but the whole company around, and the whole company had agreed in advance, in writing, in calm blood, exactly what would happen to him. They had not removed the violence of their world. They had aimed it. They had taken the same brutality the conquered would have used to crush them from above and turned it sideways, into a fence that every man helped to hold so that no man could climb it. That is the genius of the thing, and they did it without a single assessor, without a single fleet, without a center of gravity at all. They simply agreed, and the agreement freely made held tighter than any chain we had ever forged, because a chain is something done to you, and a chain is something you spend your whole life working to slip, but a promise you have made yourself, in front of the men you must stand beside in the dark, is something you would rather die than break. Many of them did. The bodies in that hold proved it. I told myself it was one ship, one unusual man, one lucky crew, an anomaly to be filed and forgotten. So before I obeyed the order to burn it, I ran one more search. I asked the Concord's great archive a single question. Had we ever seen this before in the human record? The archive answered for 6 hours, and by the end of it I understood that the prime enforcer's fear was not paranoia. It was arithmetic. It was everywhere, not the pirates alone. The pirates were merely the clearest case because they were the lawless ones, the ones who by our model should have been pure chaos, and so the order in them showed brightest against the dark. But once I knew the shape to look for, I found it across the entire human catalog. Wherever the great central power thinned out, wherever the throne could not reach, the humans did not collapse into the beasts we expected. They grew these codes. On their frontiers, in their frozen settlements, on their long voyages across their own oceans before they ever touched the void, again and again, the same pattern. Small groups of dangerous people, far from any king, sitting down and binding themselves to one another by consent, drafting their fair shares and their fixed penalties and their limits on the strongest among them. They could not help it. It was not their law. It was their nature. The conquered had spent its whole history learning to find the center of a species and seize it, and we had finally found a species with no center to seize, because every single one of them carried a piece of the center inside, and you cannot decapitate a body that is all head. Do you understand now why the prime enforcer went pale on the channel? Every species we had ever conquered, we had conquered by taking the throne. Take the head and the body kneels. But you cannot take a throne that does not exist. You cannot make a body kneel when there is no one whose surrender ends the fight. A human colony does not lose when its leader dies, because the law that holds it was never in the leader. It was in the agreement, distributed across every member, written on a paper every one of them had signed. Kill the captain and the crew elects another by the same code that bound the first, and the ship sails on. We had built an empire on a single move, and the humans were the one species in the galaxy on whom that move did nothing at all. 41 species had a head. The 42nd was all spine. And here, I think, is where I must speak of the prime enforcer's own people, and the others like them the conquered has swallowed, because the contrast is the whole of my argument, and I will not soften it. The prime enforcer's species was a triumph of imposed order. I mean that honestly. For 10,000 years they had run on top-down law of the purest kind, a single sovereign will descending through perfect ranks down to the lowest worker, no vote, no consent, no questioning, only the clean transmission of command from the one to the many. It was beautiful in the way a machine is beautiful. It was, on paper, everything the conquered admires, and it had collapsed 3 times. Each time the collapse was the same. The center failed, a sovereign died without an heir, a command corps was severed, and in the space of days the perfect ranks dissolved into nothing, because the law had never lived in the people. It had only ever lived in the one above them, and when the one above was gone, there was no law left, only frightened creatures who had never in their lives been asked to hold anything up themselves. They had to be conquered and rebuilt from the top each time, by us, which is precisely why they were so loyal to the conquered and so eager to burn the human record. The humans were living proof that there had been another way the whole time, a way that did not require them to be ruled, and a slave who learns his chains were never necessary is the most dangerous creature there is. So set the two against each other plainly. On one side, order imposed from above, magnificent and total and brittle as glass, perfect until the hand that holds it slips, and then nothing. On the other side, order grown from below, ugly and plain and scrawled on a sheet of plant fiber by criminals, and so durable that a crew of thieves held formation through starvation and disease and the cold of the void, dividing their last food to the gram, leaving a fair share beside a dying man who could not eat it, and went down together in order rather than break the promise they had made each other. One of those orders required a galaxy of fleets and enforcers, and an eye that never closes. The other required only that the strongest man aboard agree to be bound and mean it. I have spent my life serving the first. I came home from that wreck no longer certain it was the better one. I should tell you what became of them, because endings matter, and because the humans understood that better than we ever have. Thomas Hale did not die rich or free. The logs run out. But the archive filled the rest. The thing his crew fought at the end was larger than they were, and they knew it, and they fought it anyway in good order, and they lost. The compensation schedule in the articles, the fixed price of a hand and a leg and an eye, was never paid out because there was no one left to pay it to. The fair share left beside the dying man went cold and uneaten. By every measure the conquered uses to score a life, Thomas Hale failed. He took a throne he had bound, and he sailed it into the dark, and it killed him. And yet I stood in that hold, and I could not call it a failure, and I cannot call it one now, because the order he built outlived the man, which is the only test of law that has ever mattered. It outlived him in the way they died, holding to it when holding to it bought them nothing, when the easier thing, the beast's thing, the thing my models swore they would do, was to tear the fair share from the dying man's hands and fight each other for the scraps. They did not. They had signed a paper, and the paper held them past the point where anything could have made them hold but the holding itself. That is not the behavior of a beast. That is the highest thing I have ever assessed, and I have assessed the deaths of 41 species, and not one of the others ever showed me anything like it. The prime enforcer ordered me to burn the record. I have not burned it. I have brought it here, to this tribunal, with the wreck logged and preserved and every article translated, because I have decided that the conquered deserves to be a thing that can survive the truth, and if it cannot, then it is no better than the brittle perfect order that died 3 times and learned nothing. The humans are not beasts. They are the one species in the catalog that does not need us, that never needed anyone above them, that carries its law inside each member like a seed and grows it fresh wherever it lands, in their colonies and their frontiers and the stinking holds of their criminal ships. We cannot take their throne because they do not have one. We can only meet them, eye to eye, as the kind of thing we have never once met in all our conquering history. An equal. A creature that ruled itself before we ever found it, and will rule itself long after we are gone. So the next time you hear it said in the halls of the conquered that law must come from above, that the small things fly apart without a great mass to hold them, that consent is the dream of fools, and only the throne and the fleet keep the dark at bay, I would ask you to remember a wooden-hearted ship at the cold edge of a system that did not matter. Remember the fair share, measured to the gram, left beside a man too far gone to eat it. Remember that the most binding law I have ever found in this galaxy was not handed down from any throne. It was written from the bottom up, by people no one could force, signed in their own ink, held to past death, by a crew of thieves and killers who had worked out the one thing we never did. And honestly, for a foundational truth of the universe, it is a little humbling that it was first written down by a man whose own crew could vote him out of his chair on a Tuesday. It held anyway. It held better than anything we ever built. Perhaps that is the lesson. Perhaps the strongest wall in the galaxy is the one every hand helps to hold. That is the real story of the pirate code, and I think it should frighten us, but I have decided it should inspire us more.